Welcome to Zoom with ZOA. I'm Alan Jay, National Director of Outreach and Engagement. Welcome to this edition entitled What U.S. Universities Don't Want You to Know, How Foreign Funding Sways the Anti-Israel Agenda on College Campuses. I'll let our moderator introduce our guests. At this point, I just want to remind everybody that your microphones are to remain on mute. We will have a question and answer period at the end of the program. Please post your questions in the chat feature that you'll find in the bottom middle of your screen. I'd like to thank two of my colleagues for helping out tonight. Jackie Schaefer is our graphics media person, and Steve Feldman is our executive director of our Greater Philadelphia region. They're back on the other end working the controls. With that, I'm going to hand the program over to our executive director of ZOA Detroit, Kobe Erez, and have a great program, everybody.
Thank you, Alan. And welcome everybody to tonight's program. First, I want to thank you, Sheldon Freilich, our ZOA Michigan president, and our board members. Our people suffered a terrible tragedy this weekend in Israel. 45 people have died in northern Israel. And so we pray and we hope that the families can rebuild, and we share their sadness together. So tonight's program. So tonight is a very interesting night in Israel because tonight it seems like Netanyahu is giving is giving away the mandate, which means that there might be a different government that which will be formed in Israel. This means that the government that would deal with the American administration might be completely different. Why this is so important? Because the Biden administration is pushing towards the Iran deal, the Iran nuclear deal, which will allow Iran to first get funding, and second, will put Iran in a trajectory towards a nuclear bomb. So far, Netanyahu has been standing up against this, but unfortunately, it might not be the case going forward. ZOA has been fighting this nuclear deal for a while. We've been advocating for sanctions on Iran for years already. And we've actually recently partnered with the American opposition, American Iranians who are opposing the regime in Iran. And I would like you to visit the website nonuclearholocaust.com and to join our effort in fighting this deal that is coming up. In the 1930s, Chamberlain created a deal with Hitler, which was an appeasement. There were people who were against it, and today history is repeating itself. And ZOA is one of the only organizations, one of the few organizations that is standing up against this horrible deal. So we hope that you join us in this fight, and it's this opportunity right now. This time is not easy for the Jewish people. It's not easy for Israel, and we hope that you join ZOA in effort, in financial aid, in donations, so we can stand up with Israel and fight for the future. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Small. Dr. Charles Small is the founder and executive director of Institute for the Study of Global Antisemitism and Policy, a leading research institute fighting anti-Semitism globally, and research scholar at Antony's College, Oxford University. Dr. Charles Small, the stage is all yours.
So thank you, Kobe, and thank you everybody from ZOA for inviting me. It's really an honor. And the fact that so many people are here on Zoom is clear testimony to the importance of ZOA in the American Jewish community and the work that you do. So continued success and strength. And Kobe, as you were saying, we're entering into a new phase of the struggle against anti-Semitism and the struggle against political Islam. And I would even say the sort of the red-green alliance, the extreme left and the extreme Islamists, not Muslims, not Islam, but political Islam, and the sort of acquiescence to the anti-Semitism and anti-democratic behavior of political Islam. So tonight I'm going to speak about the funding of American universities. One of the main projects that we've been doing at ISGAP. ISGAP is a small research center, an international research center that deals with contemporary anti-Semitism at a scholarly level. One of the projects that we've done is look at the funding of American universities by political Islam, and I'll address that in a moment. We also run academic seminars throughout the world, and now we're doing it not only in English, but in Spanish, Arabic, and French. We have 60 scholars, 60 research scholars that are associated with us, leading professors from all over the world dealing with different forms of anti-Semitism internationally. We've done this project now for 8 years, and I'll just explain briefly how I came into this. I do more issues of social theory and philosophy, sociology, and I was working on issues of globalization and cultural identity. I was living in Israel at the time. I studied in the UK. I'm actually speaking to you from Oxford this evening, so it's midnight here, so forgive me if I'm a little slow. It's late. But I was working on issues of human rights in my studies at Oxford University. Then I made Aliyah, and I was living in Israel. I was teaching at Ben Gurion University, then Tel Aviv University. And I remember I was reading the Arabic press during the Camp David Accords, during the negotiations between Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat. And I started reading Arabic press, and I was reading more and more about the Muslim Brotherhood. And for all sorts of reasons, which I won't get into now, I started to read the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, I went to McGill University and the University of London and Oxford, very good universities. I studied politics and philosophy and sociology. And I never really, and including Middle East politics, but I never really learned much about the Muslim Brotherhood. I sort of heard about them, but I didn't really know much about them. And I think for those of you who are listening this evening, if you can take one thing away from tonight's discussion, is the importance of understanding the mind of our enemy. And we need to understand the mind of our enemy. We need to become fluent in their worldview, their ideology, their mission, their raison d'etre. And I think too often we dismiss important social movements internationally as being sort of archaic or primitive. But I assure you that the Muslim Brotherhood and political Islam are sophisticated, they're coherent, they have a religion, they have a political mission, they have military ambitions, and they are, in my humble opinion, 10 steps ahead of us who are fighting anti-Semitism. And I'll tell you, we started the first research center on anti-Semitism ever at a North American university. It was in 2006 at Yale University. And we were doing a lot of work on political Islam, on the Iranian revolutionary regime, and this ruffled feathers. So here we were, a group of scholars studying contemporary anti-Semitism, and because we were looking at the impact of political Islam and the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestinian society, throughout the Middle East, in Iran, we were perceived in the liberal institutions as somehow being advocates for Israel, sort of Zionists, right-wing, even fascists and racists. And all we were doing is looking at this phenomenon of contemporary anti-Semitism. And given the legacy of anti-Semitism in Western civilization and Western society, you would imagine that universities would not only be allowing our small research center to exist, but there'd be many research centers at North American universities dealing with this important matter. There are, of course, many research centers that deal with racism and racial inequality, as there should be. There are many research centers dealing with gender issues and women's studies, as there should be. These are issues that should be on the academic map. And of course, there should be vibrant centers dealing with contemporary anti-Semitism. And there was a lot of opposition. And we opened in 2006. And in 2011, we were closed. Despite the fact that we were running a successful research center, we had research projects, postdoc program, graduate studies program, conferences, seminars, scholars coming from all over the world to present and to share their research. We had the top scholars literally in the world coming through a place like Yale, but we were closed, and some of you I think know the story. It was kind of a contentious issue. The media covered it. It was news for a while in the summer of 2011. And the report, the academic report, or the reason why Yale closed down the center was actually deemed classified. And Alan Dershowitz, who is one of our academic board members who graduated from Yale, at the time said that he had never heard of an academic review committee being considered confidential. And none of the scholars, none of the philanthropists, none of the faculty members, none of the administrators were ever made aware why the center was closed down. There was also a human rights documentation center that dealt with issues of Iran. They were also distanced from Yale University. They were associated and they were removed from Yale. So there was sort of a silencing going on at Yale. And I would say, we were just discussing today about how the New Republic, it was a wonderful magazine that was also taken over, and the incredible writers of the New Republic sort of were dispersed, and some have not been heard from for a while. And they were doing very important work on some of these issues. So about a year after the closure of Yale, I was provided with a fellowship. I was at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University for 3 years. And one night I was alone in my small apartment in Palo Alto, and I'd finished a research project, and I started to Google. I was too wired to sleep because I just finished a book project, and I was surfing the net, and I came across an email from a former vice president of Yale University named Charles Hogan. And he was very antagonistic to our research center at Yale and the work we were doing. He thought we were basically right-wing, fascist, racist Zionists, not scholars, not doing scholarship worthy of being associated with Yale. And he was definitely a staunch opponent of what we were doing. And for the first time, I Googled him. And in about 30 minutes, I discovered what I thought could be, and this is a whole area that I wasn't very much aware of, a web of the Muslim Brotherhood at Yale. And to make a long story short, I found out that Mr. Hogan was a vice president of a pharmaceutical company in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that was owned by a gentleman called Ben Mufaz. The Ben Mufaz family is known as leading Muslim Brotherhood activists. And they're also known for trading in weapons and supplying weapons to groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. The Bin Laden family were also stakeholders in this pharmaceutical company in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And Ben Mufaz sued Yale University Press over a wonderful book by Matthew Levitt on Hamas. They were trying to get Yale University Press to stop the publication of this important book by Matthew Levitt on Hamas. And the lawsuit, Yale and Ben Mufaz settled out of court. And several months after the settlement was reached, Charles Hogan left the pharmaceutical company in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and became a vice president of Yale. When he came to Yale, he brought a woman named Aletta Wegner. Aletta Wegner worked for a gentleman called Al-Amoudi. Al-Amoudi was connected to the Clinton administration, and he's serving a 20-year prison sentence in a federal jail in the United States for running guns to Hamas and supplying weapons. Aletta Wegner was his point person in the Gulf, and she was working for Charles Hogan. Aletta Wegner's husband is a known operative for Hezbollah. And I was sort of making these connections to banks, to companies, to funds coming into Yale through foundations. And I found a lot of this information in about 30 minutes of Googling. And I couldn't believe what I was finding. And this is an area that I am, and I'm not being humble, I was definitely not an expert in. And I brought this information to scholars of counterterrorism, and I asked them, is there anything here? Is this just, Googling and making, connections that are not really valid, or is there something to this? And the experts in counterterrorism said, yes, we know this name, we know this company, we know these connections. And this began, in a sense, a research project that has gone on for 8 years. It's received support and help from scholars and experts in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, and in Israel. And we began to systematically look at the impact of funding at American universities. So I'll just say that Yosef Kawadawi, who's the head of the Muslim Brotherhood, is the head of the Qatari Foundation, which is a major Muslim Brotherhood foundation operating out of Qatar. They have over $1 billion in assets that we know of. Yosef Kawadawi has repeatedly throughout his life, he's an elderly scholar and cleric, he repeatedly states that the true believer, the true Muslim, is obligated to complete the work of Hitler. And this is a direct quote that he himself has articulated on many occasions throughout his life. And these are the people that we were dealing with. And we started to do research in sort of the ideological roots of the Muslim Brotherhood. And we found out that the Muslim Brotherhood, the ideological founders, people like Qutb and al-Banna, people that I would urge people listening tonight to go and read their work. It's available in English, and to read scholars who critique and explain the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood started roughly 100 years ago in Egypt as a reaction to British colonialism. It was sort of a reactionary social movement that fused politics with a very narrow understanding of Islam. So I in no way I'm not critiquing Islam, and I'm not critiquing Muslims, and I think this is very important. There are Muslims fighting political Islam and risking their lives in doing so, and there's moderate people that would have nothing to do with an ideology that espouses such hatred. But the Muslim Brotherhood and political Islam is a social movement, a reactionary social movement, which fuses a narrow understanding of Islam with European notions of anti-Semitism and even fascism. And we now know, and I think scholars are now exposing the connections of the Muslim Brotherhood and Husseini and other people to the Nazi movement in the 1930s and the 1940s. So there's a fusion of fascism, European fascism, and anti-Semitism as a founding element of the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood. And they also take the protocols of the Elders of Zion. And as many of you know, the protocols of the Elders of Zion were the words and ideas that justified not only anti-Semitism in Europe, but basically lay the foundation, I would argue, and scholars like Robert Wistrich and other eminent scholars of anti-Semitism lay the foundation for the Holocaust. This sort of web of lies that Jews were conspiring to take over the world and banks and Hollywood, and these sort of classical horrible forms of anti-Semitism. And as Elie Wiesel said, that the Holocaust didn't begin with the railroad tracks and the crematoriums, they began with words and ideas. And the protocols of the Elders of Zion was the foundation of the genocidal anti-Semitism that swept and destroyed not only European Jewry, but Europe itself. And this is the ideology that forms the foundation of the Muslim Brotherhood. And if anybody goes tonight and Googles the Hamas charter, you can see the Hamas, an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. You can see that they literally plagiarize from the protocols of the elders of Zion, and this forms the covenant or the constitution of Hamas. They literally plagiarize from the protocols and use it as their covenant or their founding document and their raison d'etre. So the connection of European anti-Semitism being brought into the Middle East and into the Islamic world, perhaps for the first time. Yes, there was discrimination against Jewish people in Islamic countries for centuries and serious forms of discrimination. But I would argue, and scholars would argue, that anti-Semitism is unique and it came out of Europe and it was imported into the Islamic world, namely by missionaries and through colonialism, but really incorporated and adopted by the sort of indigenous reactionary movement of the Muslim Brotherhood. Yosef Kawadawi, for example, was the founding member of the trustees of the Center of Islamic Studies at Oxford. I just walked by the center a couple of days ago, and it's a massive college, a very large complex, not just a building, but a complex of a mosque and of dormitories and classrooms. It's a large college. And Yosef Kawadawi himself was the founding member of the Board of Trustees of the Islamic Studies Center at Oxford. So here you can see a clear example of somebody who's espousing the ideology of Hitler being welcomed into elite universities in the United Kingdom, and as I'll explain in a few moments, into the United States. So in a very sophisticated manner, the Muslim Brotherhood has used soft power to influence universities and other important institutions in democratic societies. But I think what's most alarming is the influence in universities, because after all, universities are the places where young people learn to be citizens. They learn politics, they learn values, they learn ideas about democracy and ideas about Israel and Jewish people. And I would submit to you the fact that Muslim Brotherhood funding has been pouring in, not dripping in, but pouring in to universities in the Western world is in part one of the reasons why universities have become the front line in the United States, in Canada, and in the Western world in this new, what we call the new anti-Semitism or contemporary anti-Semitism. And people like Tariq Ramadan. Tariq Ramadan is the grandson of al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. And he was, until he was arrested for allegedly raping several women. He's under house arrest now in France, awaiting the outcome of his trials. But he has been an eminent scholar at Oxford University, in Notre Dame University, and he's an important intellectual which sort of fuses the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood in a very sophisticated way. He's multilingual, brought up in Europe, a great intellect, regardless if you agree or disagree or think, question the morality of the Muslim Brotherhood ideology, but he was able to speak the language of postmodernity, of multiculturalism, of integration, and has influenced a generation of scholars. People like Edward Said, the sort of the postmodern movement, which is perhaps the most dominant form of mainstream good education in the United States and in Europe, as sort of in this sort of philosophical moment. Edward Said and Michel Foucault, two important thinkers in the academy, they were supportive. For example, you mentioned Kobe earlier, the Iranian revolutionary regime. These were people who perceived the Iranian Revolution as something akin to the French Revolution, and what France was to enlightenment and democracy and liberté and égalité and fraternité. They were arguing in academic circles that this movement coming out of Iran would be what the French Revolution was to Europe, that this was going to be a similar revolution that would transform the Middle East into a better democratic, free space and society. So not looking at the contradictions of the Muslim Brotherhood, not looking at the contradictions of the Iranian revolutionary regime's ideology. And what's important to note, many people will say, well, Iran is Shiite and the Egypt and the Brotherhood are Sunni. But if you look at the ideological roots of the Iranian revolutionary regime, even though they are Shiite and they come out of the sort of Shiite context of Iran, they pay homage and respect to the founding fathers of the Muslim Brotherhood of the Sunni world. So the ideology and the social movement is definitely connected. So what we discovered through our research project was that billions of dollars were coming into American universities through our research project and the work of Michael Bass, who's an investigative accountant who went to the Department of Education and poured through their reports. They come out with reports twice a year on university funding. He was able to assemble the fact that Georgetown University, for example, received nearly $500 million from the Muslim Brotherhood. Northwestern University, $350 million. Cornell, $54 million. The Carnegie Mellon University, $200 million. Texas A&M, $132 million. And this was just in a short period of time. So we discovered $3 billion, and in 2019, we took our research project to Washington, and I was able, through the help of many good people in Washington, to present our findings in front of the head of Homeland Security, the head of the FBI, the Attorney General, the Assistant Attorney General, the Secretary of Education, and the head of Treasury. And we presented our work, and several months after our presentation in the summer of 2019, the federal government launched an investigation into illegal funding of American universities. The government recently came out with a report, and based on a year of work, they've now discovered $6.8 billion of illegal funding coming into American universities. And in the next report that will be out in a few months, I've been told that there'll be up to $18 billion in funding coming from foreign sources that are not reported. And according to the United States law, a law that was devised during the time of Nazism to stop the Nazis in Europe funding Nazis in the United States, there was a law passed that stated that any funds over $250,000 from a foreign entity must be reported by the university to the Department of Education. And we know that Yale University, which we documented over $50 million coming from the Muslim Brotherhood, they did not report any of their funding for 4 years to the Department of Education. They blame it on a clerical error. Harvard University, that received hundreds of millions of dollars from the Muslim Brotherhood, only give the Department of Education a lump sum of foreign funds. They don't say where the money was coming from. They don't break it down by donation, but they just give a lump sum to the Department of Education. So we know that the funding influences education. It's not difficult to make the correlation. In our work, we found that Qatar, the Qatari government gave $500 million of funding. The Saudis almost $300 million of funding. United Arab Emirates $200 million. And this is over $1 billion of funding just from these three countries. Now, what's interesting is that a lot of the funding that we were able to document, over $3.5 billion, it comes from foreign entities. But we know that there are domestic corporations and domestic foundations that are also funding universities and publishing houses in the United States. And nobody that I'm aware of has any idea of the magnitude of this funds that are coming into American universities. So, to make a long story short, I think I would submit to you that to understand anti-Semitism in the United States to understand why, at least in part, and I would say a significant part, why universities have become a place where not just the campus politics is unwelcoming to Jewish students and to issues of Zionism in Israel and how Jews identify as a people, but the fact that in the classroom, forget the sort of the politics and the apartheid wall and the intimidation that we all read about, but in the finest classrooms at the finest universities in the United States of America, and it's not just now in Middle East studies departments, but in mainstream social sciences and humanities, the demonization of who Jews are as a people, the demonization of Israel, the demonization of Zionism has been going on for 2 generations. And it's no wonder that now in the halls of Congress, in the Senate, at our finest media of record, at our finest media outlets, that people who go through schools of journalism and go through the social sciences at our best universities have a tainted view of Israel, have a tainted view of Jews. And I think that our community needs to wake up to the fact that this is sort of the polite anti-Semitism, and that ideas and words which led to the Holocaust are amazingly relevant today. I was brought up, I was born in Montreal. My generation, I went to McGill University in the 1980s. My generation had the world open to us. If we worked hard and studied hard, the history of my grandparents, the fact that my father couldn't go to McGill University or good Anglo-Saxon schools, those days were over and the world was open to us. To imagine that in these institutions educating our citizens, our future citizens, that they are being inculcated in part by sophisticated anti-Semites that are using social theory and philosophy and the social sciences as the foundation to educate these students. And that it comes in part from funding from the Muslim Brotherhood that have incorporated the protocols of the Elders of Zion, the protocols of the Elders of Zion that led to the Holocaust, that led to the destruction of a Jewish civilization in Europe, and to perhaps, as Ardarno would say, that Auschwitz was the end of European civilization. And yet these ideas are not only alive and well in the Shuk in Cairo, but they are alive and well at our finest universities in the United States of America. And I believe our organizations, our groups like ZOA and other Jewish organizations fighting anti-Semitism and the human rights community need to become aware of this type of pernicious anti-Semitism that is going to the heart and perhaps the most sensitive and important institution in our society. And as Elie Wiesel always taught, that anti-Semitism is not a parochial Jewish problem or an Israeli problem. Anti-Semitism begins with the Jews, but it never ends with the Jews. And this reactionary social movement is anti-democratic, it's sexist, it's homophobic, it's anti-other. And this is what is being allowed to fund our most esteemed institutions of higher learning, and to fund chairs of departments, to fund institutes and research centers. And it's having a significant impact. And I'll just say for a moment, I'll just speak for a moment. We did a report about a year ago on the Students for Justice in Palestine. There's hundreds of chapters throughout American and Canadian universities from the Students for Justice in Palestine. The Students for Justice in Palestine are connected historically to the Muslim Student Association, and the Muslim Student Association is connected directly, not indirectly, but directly to the Muslim Brotherhood. And you can see the demonization of Israel, the inability for the Muslim Brotherhood to recognize Israel in any form. The fact that Israel, regardless of where the borders are, if it's the Green Line or if it's into the disputed territories, if it's even just Tel Aviv, where Jews and Christians and men and women are equal citizens under one law, This is not acceptable to the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood, who are opposed to democratic societies. They see it as an extension of colonialism, and they want to replace democracy, capitalism, socialism, communism, anything that emanates from the West with a caliphate in which Muslims are higher than the protected minorities or the protected others. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is playing out on the campuses, and our students are confronting the Students for Justice in Palestine with a more vulgar, more action-oriented forms of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. But I think perhaps the most pernicious and dangerous form of anti-Semitism is the hijacking of our education, the hijacking of our universities and the ideas that young people are learning about as we speak. And I think it's high time that our community investigate this. We're just a small research center. I stumbled upon this by mistake, and we've done a small project that has begun to have some traction in the United States. I hope the current administration will continue the investigation. But it's high time Jewish organizations and human rights organizations take this very seriously. How is it possible that people who are stating that the true believer must continue the work of Hitler, how are these people funding anything in a university is beyond my comprehension. So I'll leave it there, and I know other people are going to speak, and I'll be happy to take questions or comments. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Small, for this fascinating talk. We're still, don't go anywhere. We're still, we got many questions for you. But first I would like to go to Susan Tuchman, our director of ZOA Center for Law and Justice. Susan has been fighting the fight on behalf of pro-Israel students in America, across American universities. Susan is right there for the students whenever they counter anti-Semitism. I'm proud to present Susan, and we would love to hear from you.
Thank you, Kobe. And Dr. Small, it's really an honor for me to be here with you this evening and with every one of you. We at the Center for Law and Justice really deal with the consequences of what Dr. Small talked about this evening. Jewish students who are facing so much anti-Israel sentiment inside the classroom and outside the classroom that it is really affecting their emotional well-being and their physical well-being. Jewish students who we work with who feel threatened, they feel harassed in the classroom, they are afraid to speak up and express their Jewish identity by expressing their support for Israel. They're ostracized on many campuses by their peers if they dare to do that. And these are the students that we work with every day. You're going to be hearing from my colleague, Jonathan Ginsburg, shortly, who heads our campus department. I'm proud to say that the ZOA was the first organization to use a federal civil rights law to address these kinds of problems, to address anti-Semitic harassment on campus and discrimination on campus. We used a federal law called Title VI of the Civil Rights Act to protect Jewish students from anti-Semitic harassment and discrimination. Our case was a groundbreaking case back in 2004, and we have continued to use Title VI to help Jewish students on campuses across the country. Dr. Small also talked about how foreign funding is affecting and influencing the conversations about Israel inside the classroom and outside the classroom. And we've been working on some of that ourselves, but we've been dealing with the fact that these Middle East study centers are one-sided and hostile to Israel, and they're being funded by our federal taxpayer dollars. There are Middle East studies centers across the country at very prestigious universities who receive federal funding under a federal law called Title VI. It's a different Title VI from the one that I referred to earlier. This is Title VI of the Higher Education Act. And these Middle East Study Centers receive federal funding in order to encourage the study of foreign languages and places that our government deems vital to our national security interests. And to get this federal funding, these Middle East Study Centers have to comply with what the law says. And the law is clear. It says that these centers have to present activities that reflect diverse perspectives and a wide range of views. And they don't do that. Many of them don't do that. They're not presenting diverse viewpoints. They are presenting one-sided views that tend to be hostile to Israel. And before the pandemic started, we actually were successful in addressing a problem at one of these Title VI funded Middle East Study Centers. There was a Middle East Studies consortium between Duke University and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. This consortium receives Title VI funding. It's supposed to present activities and programs that reflect a diversity of viewpoints. But back in 2019, the consortium did a 3-day conference about Gaza. There was nothing diverse about it. It was completely one-sided and hostile to Israel. And making matters worse, during the conference itself, the conference featured a rap singer, a rapper, who got up and he said, "I'm going to sing my anti-Semitic song." He said, "and I want the audience to join in with me." And there was video of this. You could hear, there was audio. You could hear what happened at this Gaza conference. The rapper started singing his song, and the audience, which was comprised of professors and administrators and students and many others, they were all very eager to join in, and they all sang along with the rapper. They sang a song, "Oh, I'm in love with a Jew." And you could hear them singing and laughing like it was some big joke. And it was horrifying. We reported this conference to the Department of Education. We filed a complaint. We said that this consortium was receiving federal funding. These are our taxpayer dollars, and they're being misused in a way that attacks Jews and attacks Israel. And the Department of Education responded. It made the consortium, as a condition of getting future funding, the consortium has to show the Department of Education that it's going to be in compliance with Title VI and reflect diversity of viewpoints. There's not enough time to cover all the problems that we're dealing with every day at the ZOA, but I will tell you the problems are so serious. As Dr. Small said, this is affecting what students are learning about Israel, and it's shaping their thinking about Israel, which they're taking these, what they learn in college, out into the world with them. And they're our future leaders. And so we really want them to get a perspective on Israel that is accurate and balanced. If you know of problems of this nature on any campus, students who are facing anti-Semitism, vicious anti-Israel sentiment, please don't hesitate to contact us. This is how we learn about problems on campuses across the country from people like you. Please reach out to us. If we don't know about the problem, we can't address the problem. And the only way that we can effectively address campus anti-Semitism is if we stand up to it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Susan. Jonathan Ginsburg, our director of ZOA's campus department. He's meets with students every day. He's on the ground and would love to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Kobe, and thank you, Dr. Small, for the talk, and of course to Susan Tuchman, who just does invaluable work for students and is a great partner of mine. Just briefly, in summary, I will say that the challenges over the past year, despite the fact that we have shifted to remote learning for the most part, have really increased, even compared to years past. And I say that specifically speaking about the types of radical events, the types of extreme voices being amplified on campus. Even in past years where we've had many difficult experiences with traditional apartheid walls during anti-Israel week, Israel apartheid week, so to speak. But within the past semester, 2 semesters, we've seen extremely dangerous trends happening directly from faculty and from campuses specifically. One example, San Francisco State University. I'm sure many of you have already heard about this controversy, but they brought a convicted terrorist, Leila Khalid, to speak as part of a faculty-sponsored Zoom event. Obviously, that attracted significant controversy, and ZOA led the charge in pressuring the university and the administration. And thankfully, certain platforms like Zoom and Facebook did take the appropriate action to make sure she was not given that platform for her talk. Therefore, this type of extremism, terrorism, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, all rolled in one, was now being conflated with issues relating to free speech. And as we all know, hate speech certainly is not free speech. And these are the issues we're facing, and students now more than ever, they feel vulnerable. They feel like their voices count less than other minority groups when they experience anti-Semitism on campus. And it's very, very difficult. Thanks to the ZOA campus, we are there. We work with students across the country from various organizations, as well as Israel professionals, both within Hillel, Chabad, and other partners. And we do so much to help support them. And really, through all of that work, we want to empower the students to make them to understand that Zionism is not a dirty word, as unfortunately we're seeing it being tarnished increasingly. And conversations have shifted from discussions about Israeli policies to now Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. And this is obviously, of course, where we draw the red line. And many of you also probably heard about the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, which really expansively covers anti-Semitism in the 21st century that so often conflates with anti-Israel activity. And there are so many misconceptions and misinformation and lies that are surrounded when it comes to conversation about IRA. And we see, unfortunately, groups on the left trying to also claim that the IRA definition restricts free speech about Israel, and it's absolutely false. There's nowhere within the IRA definition that restricts free speech or discussions about Israel's policy. But for us, one of our most important messages is that anti-Zionism is a contemporary form of anti-Semitism. The denial of self-determination to the Jewish people in our own ancestral homeland, the only Jewish state, the only safe haven we have in the world, is a form of anti-Semitism. Denying that to the Jewish people while affording that to all other people, that is undoubtedly anti-Semitism. And we've really been amplifying our voices for that. Excuse me, sorry, I have a little one, I apologize. Please, thank you. Sorry, it's bedtime, just one moment, apologies.
No problem, Jonathan. We're
sorry.
We're almost in time
anyway,
for the questions.
And sorry about that. In a nutshell, I'm happy to also just share a little bit about my personal life. I grew up here in the States. I spent almost 9 years living in Israel as a dual citizen. I served as a lone soldier in the IDF, and I moved back here after Operation Tzuk Eitan and Operation Protective Edge. And I remember my time as a student during the Second Intifada, and I remember things were bad, but it's nothing compared to how things have changed on the ground since 2014. And sadly, every year the extremism continues to mount and mount and mount. And our main effort is to really engage as many students as we can positively about Israel, to empower them, to really allow them to understand the reality of what's happening in a very, very complex region, and to understand the rights, the inalienable rights of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. So thank you so much, and sorry about that.
No problem. Thank you, Jonathan. So we'll go to the questions. There are many questions. I apologize. We're going to go 5 minutes over our regular time. But here's the first question from Gloria Zimmerman. She says, my children attend Cornell and Northwestern, both schools you mentioned that receive money from these anti-Semitic and anti-Israel sources. How can I fight back? Dr. Small.
So it's a great question. And also, Susan and Jonathan, thank you for your comments and the amazing work that you're both doing, in my humble opinion. So thank you. So I think that for parents and grandparents who work hard and send their children and grandchildren to these illustrious universities that are also, they're very expensive, and it's an investment in your children and grandchildren's future, that I think that the university should be held accountable. And there is information that is now well documented, not just by ISGAP, and we're happy to share it. Our reports on our website, but it's also now from the federal government and their investigation. And I think that there's no other group that would that our society and these universities would tolerate the hatred. If a professor was connected to the Ku Klux Klan or to the Nazis, I'm pretty sure that they would be removed from campus, that these type of fascist, racist anti-Semitism is not tolerated in these liberal institutions. And here we have funding coming from the most pernicious, anti-democratic, anti-American, anti-Semitic, reactionary social movement, perhaps on the planet. And if our universities it's now documented that they're taking funds from it, I think these universities must be held accountable. And I think that parents should get organized and speak to your kids, other students' parents and grandparents, and start writing letters and call the presidents of the universities and say that this is just not tolerable. How is it possible in 2021 that we allow funds to come from foreign sources that are anti-democratic, anti-American, and are inflaming universities to focus on specific targeted groups, ethnic and religious groups of students and faculty. Faculty is also having an increasingly difficult time on many campuses. And how can we allow these institutions to take funds from these organizations and foundations that are shifting the discourse in the classroom and changing the atmosphere on the campus? How is it possible that we allow funds from these genocidal, anti-Semitic, racist, anti-democrats to influence these very precious institutions? And I think there's over 100 people on this call. I would urge you to write letters to the president of these universities. I know that the universities are sensitive to these issues, and if your voices are heard and it's publicized, I'm confident that the universities will respond. They'll have to respond.
A question from Neil Schloss. Where is Congress in this problem?
That's a good question. I hope that this federal investigation will lead to more awareness. And I think that there are members of Congress and the Senate that have good relations with the Jewish community, that care about these issues. And I think that your elected officials should also be made aware of these issues, and they should bring it up in these very important institutions of government.
Question from Joseph Flashner. As far as funding from foreign countries, is there a possibility for changing the tax code when it comes to universities receiving foreign donations?
So that's a question which to be honest, I don't know enough about the legal system and the tax code, but I know that there is a law in the United States that exists, that foreign donations of over $250,000 are, by the current law, must be recorded by the university and shared and reported back to the Department of Education every year. And universities have not been doing that, and they're breaking the law.
So, by the way, we had close to 200 people. We appreciate your participation, and this issue is very important. So we're very happy at ZOA to see you guys participate, and we hope to take this forward. Awareness is the first stage. Here's another question from ZOA Florida board member Steve Perls. How common is it for the PA to be purchasing academic positions for their people at American universities as they did at Harvard, Belfer Center? And if it is common, are all of those positions documented somewhere? I know it's a tough question, but throwing it out there.
Right. So I don't know the answer to it, but I would say this, that the PA is an impoverished, poor, fragile entity. But the Saudis, maybe now they're changing. There's some evidence that they may be changing, but the Saudis and the Qataris have been funding American universities at a level that far surpasses anything the PA can do. And the ideology of Hamas and members of Fatah come out of the Muslim Brotherhood, and Qatar and Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states, which represent a very similar political philosophy and ideology and mission and come from the same ideological roots. They've been funding American universities with billions and billions of dollars. We don't even know how much they've been influencing our universities. So I think that, to me, that's the most crucial area that we need to investigate and research further. And the one thing that's amazing and wonderful about the United States of America and its democracy is that citizens have power and the rights. And if our community and 172 people on this call get organized and start writing letters to their university presidents and to their elected officials, I think that the system works and there could be change.
So before the next question, it's important to note, in the past 2 weeks, there was a case in France, I'm sure many of you know. There was a Jewish woman by the name of Sarah Halimi, and she was brutally murdered by a Muslim. And recently, there was a court case, and the judge in France basically released the murderer, and the excuse was because he was high on marijuana. And this doesn't come from a vacuum. This comes from building stages of anti-Semitism, showing that Jews are the oppressors, Israel is the oppressor, so the Jewish people are an oppressor. And there's a direct correlation between that and between what's going on in the United States and how hatred towards Jewish students is acceptable. So and this is why it's so important. The next question is from Len Getz, our ZOA National Board member. And again, this is a tough question, so I understand if you don't know it. What is the penalty? What is the penalty to universities for non-disclosure of foreign monies?
Okay, it's a good question, but I'll just speak briefly to the Sarah Halimi case, which is an incredible miscarriage of justice, which I hope will be remedied. I think there is a backlash in France, and hopefully it will be addressed. But the fact, as you were saying, Kobe, that the Jewish people are perceived as white, elitists, racist, reactionary Zionists comes out of 2 generations of scholarship. And the fact that the Jewish people were exterminated 2 generations ago for not being white, and now we are being classified as white, not as an apology and welcome to the club and sorry for what happened, but we're being, categorized as the ultimate colonial racist. And this comes out of education. This comes out of the philosophy and the social sciences that our students have been learning for 2 generations. And this case in France is a manifestation of this twisted logic, this twisted education system that is permitting and acquiescing to these horrific miscarriages of justice and violence, and in this case, even somebody being led to being murdered from this twisted ideology of the sort of red-green alliance and the acquiescence of our educational system to this horrific, hateful ideology. So going back to your question, so the universities are obligated to disclose the funding sources, foreign funding sources, to the Department of Education. And if they don't, they're breaking the law. Now, will any university be sanctioned or fined or held to the law? I'm not sure, but I think that if there was a groundswell of awareness and pressure on universities and government, elected government officials to do something and to enforce the law, I believe that things could change.
Thank you, Dr. Small, and thank you, everybody. Just one more note. We are in a crucial time right now, and what happened in Germany, what happened in Europe 80 years ago, didn't happen all of a sudden. It was created in stages. And we see today, I just saw today an Iranian army official saying that what Hitler took 5 years to do, killing 6 million Jews, he can do in one day. There are 6 million Jews in the state of Israel right now. And Iran is serious about their will to destroy the state of Israel, and they will do whatever it takes to get there. Unfortunately, we are today fighting a battle where there are many forces, many states, including people in the administration, in this administration in the United States, who are helping the Iranians get to their goal, to their ability to achieve nuclear capabilities. And unfortunately, ZOA is one of the few organizations that is really standing up towards anti-Semitism, and we need your help. The amount of money that we are up against, like Dr. Small said before, it comes to universities, but it also comes through lobbying. Even in Jewish organizations like J Street, they get millions and millions of dollars from the Iranians and from other countries that are anti-Israel. And we at ZOA, we count on you. We count on you to help us, to be there on the ground for us, but also, to be honest, to help fund us, because every dollar that you give goes, our team, our staff, and I'm proud to be part of ZOA. We always think, what can we do for Israel? How can we protect Jewish people who are pro-Israel, and we're there for you. We're there for the Jewish people. So we hope that you will support us, donate, help us promote our message as well. And I want just to mention that we are going to have next Tuesday a very interesting event from Israel. Updates from the ZOA in Israel, featuring Danny Luz. He's going to talk about the current status and the impact of the elections in Israel. This is very important. This is actually history in the making today. Netanyahu wasn't able to form a government, which means that we might end up with a government in Israel from the left that is going to support the Iranian deal, believe it or not. So I hope that you will join us next Tuesday, noon, 12 o'clock, 12 p.m. Hope you join us. And Jackie, our marketing director, just posted in the chat. You can go there. You can go to the ZOA.org to check it out. Again, check out the website, nonuclearholocaust.com. Help us and our Iranian allies who are trying to fight the regime. And thank you all for coming. Thank you, Dr. Small. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Jonathan. And I'm Israel Chai. Thank you, everybody.